our webinar. I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on YouTube in a few days. So in the event that you want to watch this again, it will be available to the public. This webinar, we are going to be focusing on an interdisciplinary look at trans and gender nonconforming inclusion in STEM. We have a panel of 3 experts in this field, and our speakers are Dr. Maggie Delano, who is an associate professor of engineering at Swarthmore College, Dr. Sarah Lipschutz, who is an assistant professor of biology at Duke University, Dr. Suzanne Thornton, who is a statistician at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and also serves as the chair of the ASA LGBTQ plus Advocacy Committee, the committee in which this webinar has been organized by. So again, thank you all for joining us. And I want to give you just a brief idea of what this webinar will entail. So each panelist will speak for, roughly 20 minutes or so. And after the 3 panelists speak, we'll have a question and answer session. So, if you happen to have questions during any of the speakers, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And then at the end of our webinar, the end of our session, we will address those questions. So just don't hesitate to drop in your questions and they will be addressed later on. Before we start off with our panelists, I just want to give a brief introduction. I would like to take a moment at the beginning of this webinar to speak briefly on issues of homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. The Stonewall riots, which was the catalyst moment in the gay liberation movement, now referred to as the LGBTQ movement, it occurred 55 years ago, 1969. These riots were a reaction against police brutality and government persecution through what we now call the Lavender Scare. Although great strides have been made societally and legally since 1969, many LGBTQ plus folk may not feel comfortable to come out either to themselves or to others. Some people are harassed for conducting research or promoting work that affirms LGBT rights and autonomy. A few months ago, one of our panelists had to withdraw from being a part of this webinar. And after receiving threatening hate mail for their LGBT affirming work and their transgender identity. I think it's important to remember that even if you do not personally identify as LGBT, there's likely people in your midst that do and have struggled with adversity around their identity. And I want to be clear and just say, I see you. We see you. So thank you for sharing your time and your attention with us today. And let's begin the webinar. Our first speaker today will be Sarah. Dr. Sarah Lipschutz is an assistant professor of biology at Duke University. She graduated with a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville in 2018. Her research group focuses on the evolution of sexual phenotypes across weird and wonderfully diverse species of birds. This work bridges Muddy Boots' experimental fieldwork with a variety of molecular and computational approaches in genomics, in neuroscience, and endocrinology. The title of her talk is Multivariate Models of Animal Sex, Breaking Binaries in Biology. So again, Sarah, I'll let you take the mic and share your screen.
Found the unmute button. I want to confirm you guys can see my main slides and not my presenter view.
I can see it. It's good.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks so much for being here and happy Pride Month. I'm really excited to talk to you about this work. And as an introduction, I'm a biologist here in this statistics symposium, and I want to clarify that I am speaking on behalf of my work and the work of my lab. I don't speak for all biologists, but I'm going to talk about the ways that my research intersects with sex variation and diversity. We study a few different avian or bird systems, and we work on lots of different topics in biology, spanning from neuroendocrinology to behavioral ecology to evolution. And recently, we've been working through conceptual frameworks and methodologies and analytical approaches beyond a binary view of sex. And specifically, I'm going to talk today about two recent papers, one in the Journal of Integrative and Comparative Biology, and another in the journal Hormones and Behavior. And I want to acknowledge my amazing co-authors who made these projects really fun and interesting. So I'll start with what I view as the problem. Many scientists, biologists included, who study the natural world, are really into categories. We want to fit everything into neat classifications and rules. And these can be really useful frameworks for understanding nature. But this is also a flawed endeavor because nature doesn't really recognize categories. I confronted this during my PhD when I was studying hybridization and speciation in birds. And there are over 20 definitions for what a species is, and debates among biologists can get surprisingly contentious about whose species concept you accept. And so when one part of animal diversity conflicts with our categorical expectations, we can respond in a few different ways. We can view this as an aberration, an exception to the rule, and ignore it or discount it. Or we can expand our framework to include this diversity. And here I'm going to present a framework for expanding our definition of sex in biology and propose some ways that we can measure and analyze with that expanded view. So what exactly is biological sex? As with our many species concepts, biologists have many definitions of sex. Sex is a process, how animals reproduce, but it's also a category. And sex is often viewed in a binary model. So here we have individuals classified as either the category of male or female. And this binary view is supported by the cellular mechanisms of sexual reproduction, in which multiple, usually two, parental gametes combine genotypes to create an offspring. And in animals, these gametes are of different sizes, a large ova and small sperm. Now, most biologists recognize that there are usually two gamete types. There are lots of really interesting exceptions, especially if you look at fungi. But I'd like to present the case more broadly that defining sex by gametes alone and relying on strict binary categories of sex fails to accurately capture sex diversity. So many of us biologists use the term sex to encompass a broad constellation of sexual traits beyond gametes across genetic, endocrine, morphological, behavioral levels of organization. And I would argue that sex is not binary, and it's not even one thing. But most biologists typically treat sex as binary, especially statistically. So we'll take two groups, male and female, and based on their gametes or our assumption of what those gametes are, because we usually don't actually know, we flatten their trait variation into a binary. And so I want to kind of have a point of clarification here that most of us know sex and gender are different. And though the term gender has sometimes been used to describe sexual phenotypes in non-human animals, I think it's key to differentiate between the cultural phenomenon of human gender and the observed traits of other organisms that we broadly call sex. There are many definitions of sex and gender. Here, I define human gender as an internal personal experience that expresses itself in the context of an individual's specific culture, place, and time. And it's important to validate the role of gender in the human experience, especially with regard to transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming identities. But if animals have gender, we biologists have no way of knowing what their genders are. This is inaccessible to us as human scientists. And that brings us back to what sex is. So here is this binary model. We've got our two categories. And maybe a more inclusive definition of sex could be bimodal, with most individuals falling within one or two peaks, one of two different peaks of a trait distribution. Well, lots of biologists use this bimodal approach. When they compare between two sex categories, this is often framed as sexual dimorphism, the condition where sexes of the same species exhibit different morphological characteristics. But how big are these differences and how much does that matter? Biologists often look more for differences than we do for similarities. And a recent paper that came out this year examined sexual dimorphism in body size across mammals. So in this figure, we see a phylogeny or an evolutionary tree of the major mammalian groups here on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis at 0, this dotted line here, there is no difference in body size between females and males. And we can see that most mammalian groups do overlap with 0. So this study found that contrary to popular belief, only 45.1%, less than half of the 400 species measured, had male-biased sexual dimorphism. And so this suggests that we might need to revisit our assumptions on sex difference in body size in mammals and in other organisms, and perhaps that sex differences isn't the right framing if we want to understand drivers of variation in body size. I would argue even further that a bimodal model is an oversimplification because sex comprises multiple traits, each with their own variable distribution. And so there are shortcomings to assuming and analyzing sex as binary or even bimodal. So perhaps this more expansive view that we propose is one that is multivariate. And in this framework, individuals may possess different combinations of traits that we think of as sex: chromosomes, anatomy, hormones, etc. These traits don't always align in binary ways. There are multiple trait values, each with different distributions. And I'll give you some examples of this multivariate model of animal sex from my own research on birds. So this bird here is a jacana. It's a tropical shorebird, and I've been studying them for over 10 years. And this individual has ZW chromosomes. This is a common type of sex determination in birds, and I'd categorize this individual as female. And in jacanas, the males have 2 copies of Z chromosomes. Females have 1Z, 1W. And that might seem pretty binary in alignment with gametic sex. But if we look across animals, the mechanisms of sex determination vary widely. And so what might be the most familiar to us are in this top row here, the XXXY determination in mammals and ZZZW in birds. But there's also haplodiploid sex determination, which involves 1 or 2 copies of the genome, as with these insects. In some cases, a mutation on the X chromosome can override the presence of a Y chromosome, like in these mice. sex can be determined by temperature. In other species, we have no idea what determines their sex. We're still looking for it in the genome and we can't find it. And so we really don't have a universal framework of genetic sex, and it's not always binary. Another component of sex are hormones, and especially the gonadal or so-called sex steroid hormones. This includes testosterone and estrogen. And these hormones influence many sexual phenotypes. This can include morphological traits like gonad size, body size, ornamentation, reproductive states like estrous cycling and gametogenesis, and behaviors like courtship, mating receptivity, aggression, parental care. And while we might hear more about testosterone's role in males, and typically male animals do have higher levels of testosterone in circulation than females, it's really important to acknowledge that testosterone is not only a male hormone and estrogen is not only a female hormone. And so individuals in both of these groups have the same molecular machinery to produce and respond to testosterone. In songbirds, testosterone is actually converted to estradiol in the brain, and that produces song. And we think of that as sort of a male hormonal action in song production, and it's really the role of estradiol. In my own research on jacanas, I found when looking at levels of testosterone in their serum that testosterone levels vary both with gametic sex and with breeding stage. So here we've got females and males in two breeding stages. The males are either parenting or they're courting. And when they're parenting, males have similar levels of testosterone to females. But in contrast, testosterone levels peak when males are courting. And so we've got continuous variation in this hormonal modality of sex, which varies both with breeding stage and with gametic sex. And I also have extended this work to studying bird brains. So we often hear about the male brain or the female brain. And in jacanas, we've looked at a brain region associated with mating behavior and parental care. It's the preoptic area of the hypothalamus. And we focus on a gene that encodes the androgen receptor. This can be thought of as promoting sensitivity to androgens like testosterone. So a gene that encodes testosterone sensitivity. And we see that females and courting males have a range of expression values of this gene that encodes the receptor, but parenting males have a much lower expression of the androgen receptor. And that suggests that they have decreased sensitivity to testosterone at this parental stage. And further suggests that sensitivity to testosterone depends not only on your gametic sex, but also on your breeding stage. In another research project on 10 different species of songbirds, we looked at the expression of 10,000 genes in the amygdala, and we looked at overall patterns of expression by plotting this principal components analysis for these genes. And we see a clustering of different families of birds together. Then we see a clustering of species, and then we see a clustering of females and males. And so this idea of male brains and female brains here, well, they're sharing patterns closely within a species and within a family relative to across all of these species. And so from this evolutionary comparison, there is no male or female brain. There are species brains and bird brains, and the level of analysis matters. Now, behavior is really the main focus of my research, and in jacanas, female-female competition determines mating success. So females compete with each other to get these territories, and those territories contain males, and males do all the parental care. This includes incubation, brooding chicks. You can see in this picture here, there's this parenting behavior in the male. There's lots of little chick legs that are dangling from his wings. And so parental care has evolutionarily been lost in females. And this behavioral example contradicts the traditional sex roles of male competition and female care that we have, I think, as a field come to expect in animals. But there are many examples in fish and frogs and birds and even mammals that contradict this notion of traditional sex roles. So this is really our expanded conceptual framework for biological sex, this multivariate model. Now, what does that mean for our statistical analyses? We have our conceptual framework, but what do we do with our data? How do we design our studies? How do we analyze these data? And so in a different project, this was a paper led by Christina Smiley and Kat Munley. And this section was led by colleagues Tessa Solomon Lane and Tessa Patton. We thought about how we might analyze sex-related variables in our research. And the authors on this project are all behavioral neuroendocrinologists. So we study the brain, we study neurons, we study hormones, all understanding what shapes variation in behavior. And it's important to give some kind of historical context for this work. So in 1993, the NIH established guidelines to include women and members of underrepresented racial and ethnic groups in clinical research. And in 2016, the NIH implemented further guidelines on the consideration of sex as a biological variable, or SABV. These were extremely important changes for inclusion and for health outcomes, and it seemed to really work for human subjects. But there is still a huge gap in including females in research in biology. And there's another problem, which is that the approach to analyzing sex as a biological variable has been mostly binary. So researchers are taking typically two categorical groups, male and female, comparing differences in some trait of interest, such as cortisol levels. Then they do something like a t-test or run a generalized linear mix model. And then they visualize those results in a bar plot or a box plot showing the means between those two categorical groups. So in this paper, we argue that sex is so much more interesting than that. And sex-related variables are not always categorical and binary. You can have continuous sex-related variables like gonad size, body size, hormone levels, aggression levels. And you can analyze these variables with many more statistical approaches than a t-test that compares two categories. And ultimately, we argue that these approaches can reveal interesting patterns that might help us identify the underlying biological processes explaining variation in our data, rather than imposing this sort of strict binary categorical view, which might limit our ability to actually identify those biological processes. So we pose basically the following questions to researchers who study sex-related variables. From the conceptual framework to the experimental approach to the analysis and interpretation of results. And so some examples here are, does my research make assumptions about sex as binary or univariate? Do I define my variables explicitly? Do I use them consistently? A big problem in biology is we often infer the categorical sex of our organisms, but we don't know what their chromosomes are. We don't know what their gametes are. And for a long time, actually, that prevented us from understanding the prevalence of female bird song. Biologists would look at a bird that was singing and say, oh, well, in birds, only males sing. And so that bird must be a male if it's singing. And once we understood, say, that they might have different chromosomes, and that's actually a female bird singing, now we understand that, wow, there's actually really interesting variation in the production of song of different species of birds and when functionally it's used. And so a lot of times those inferences really can prevent us from exploring the natural variation and understanding it fully. So how did I identify the sex of my subjects? What sex-related variables am I measuring? What is the context, developmental, seasonal, social, that might shape these sex-related variables? And then when I've got my data in hand, how am I analyzing it? Am I going to choose a categorical analysis, or am I going to look at the continuous variation of some trait? And then what language am I using to interpret these results? Is it inclusive or is it limiting of sex diversity? How are my preconceived notions affecting my interpretation of the data? What is my positionality? How is my lived experience shaping the work that I'm doing? And so I've left some QR codes here. I really encourage you to take a look at this paper. And I'm super happy to be part of this webinar and looking forward to taking questions at the end. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Sarah, for such an engaging talk. And I think that it really is applicable for people, not just biologists, but people that, work in really any field of kind of thinking about our own biases and our own frame of mind and how that can actually impact our own research. So thank you for that. Our second speaker today is Dr. Maggie Delano. They are an associate professor of engineering at Swarthmore College. Their research focuses on the development of inclusive medical technologies with an emphasis on wearables and machine learning. They have published multiple articles related to gender and machine learning, focusing on how the use of sex and gender-related variables in modern medicine are exclusionary of trans and non-binary people. Professor Delano received their PhD in electrical engineering and computer science with a minor in women's and gender studies from MIT in 2018. And for further information about Professor Delano's work, you can find that on their website, maggiedelano.com. The title of their talk today is Supporting Trans Scientists from Healthcare to Academia. So Maggie, you now should be able to take the mic and share your screen.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. And yeah, I'm excited to be following up on Sarah's presentation because I have a lot of similar things to say, but kind of basically taking some of the ideas and say, okay, well, if we could talk about sex diversity, what about gender diversity, and what about these same kinds of things, but in humans instead of non-human species? So excited to talk about that, and then I'll also talk a little bit about supporting trans scientists in the workforce as well. So before I get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about and acknowledge collaborators. So a lot of the gender and machine learning work has been done with Kendra and Denai. So I want to acknowledge them. And then the paper that I'm going to talk about at the end about rigorous science demanding the support of demands support of transgender scientists. That was a huge collaboration with so many people. Just want to give them a shout out as well. And so, as many of us know, more and more students, faculty, and staff in academia are identifying as transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming. So even in my short time as a professor, I've just noticed that I have more and more trans students in my classes, and it's really important to support all these people inside and outside of the academy. And there's also been, and kind of related to this, I think there's been a big backlash. So there's been a lot of discussions about sex and gender in research, in healthcare, et cetera. Some in good faith, many not in good faith. And in machine learning, the reason it's a big focus is because it's becoming increasingly integrated into society. And so, especially around medical technologies, we need to make sure that they're accounting for the complexities of sex and gender. And so I'm going to talk about what sex and gender are. Sarah's already talked about this a little bit, so I can kind of breeze through that. Then we'll also talk about in humans, how are sex and gender measured? How are they used in machine learning? What can people do to make these things exclusive and possible? And then also, how can we support trans scientists more broadly? So this diagram of what is sex is taken from a great article by Beans Veloci in a special issue of Cell, which is the same special issue that this rigorous science paper was published in. So I definitely encourage you to check out that that whole Cell special issue. And also, as Sarah said, sex is a very complicated thing. So sometimes people try to very narrowly define sex as this gonads thing, as basically only or even as gamete size, basically saying, you can't change your sex, and therefore that has all these downstream societal implications that are just obviously not there. And kind of when we think about the difference between sex and gender, there's often kind of a thought that, okay, sex is this thing over here, it's all the biology stuff, and then gender is all the stuff in your brain, it's all the psychological stuff. But in practice, we can kind of think of them actually as somewhat sort of intertwined. And so a lot of times in the research, people will actually talk about sex/gender or even gender/sex, with the idea that the things that a person does in the world will have some impact on their physiology. So you actually really can't even necessarily decouple sex and gender at all. And so I had this article, this slide in here, which is actually from one of the articles that Sarah talked about in her presentation. But I think it's a really good illustration of this idea that breaking binaries will lead to better science. So there's many arguments for considering sex and gender. There's the health equity argument, and there's also a rigor and reproducibility argument. So if we do these things, we can better understand fundamental aspects of science. But we also can provide better care. And those things are, people are different, people are motivated by different aspects of those things, but they're actually both true in this kind of case. So I want to talk a little bit about how we actually measure sex and gender. So it turns out that, as Sarah alluded to, this idea that we often don't know what someone's gametes actually are, and that's true in humans too. So usually when a child is born, a doctor looks at their genitals and then makes a determination about what sex to assign them. So this scale here is the satirical one from an intersex activist. But the idea here is they basically kind of look at a baby's erectile tissue and then make a decision about what sex to assign them. It's very rare that there's any actual chromosomes that are sequenced in order to figure this out. And then when we talk about like how someone reports their sex, there's many different ways that could happen. One of the most common ones is to just look at someone and pick. And then the other one is to use some sort of identifier to choose that information. We can see there can be a lot of issues with this because someone can change their sex marker or their sex marker might not align with their physiology in some other way. When it comes to gender, there's a lot of different surveys. So the statisticians might have lots of opinions about two-step surveys. So two-step surveys are basically where you ask someone, like in this case, you ask what is your sex or gender, and then what sex were you assigned at birth, basically trying to like tease apart whether or not someone is trans or not. And there's lots of different ways to ask this question, but usually the best practice is considered that because gender might not be coupled with sex, you want to basically affirm the individual and let them identify what their gender is. And so how are sex and gender used in medical machine learning? So one of the best ways to kind of get an insight about how sex and gender data are used is to actually look at how they're used in electronic health records. And so when I did some research about this, I kind of divided what we see in electronic health records into kind of three main epochs of time. So kind of before the 2010s, there was basically only sex data used. So it was male, female, or unknown. EHRs historically haven't had any good representation for intersex patients. So it was really just MF or U. And there was nothing for gender at all. So it was just no field available. Sometimes people would put it in the notes. Like if you went to the doctor might say this person's a transgender male or whatever. But the kind of consequence of that is you wouldn't necessarily know when you saw someone's sex, like what does that actually mean? And what consequences might that have for their physiology? And then in the 2010s to 2020s, the sex variable hadn't really changed, but there was this optional gender identity category. And the implication of that was mostly just that people got misgendered less. It didn't necessarily affect their clinical care as much as one would hope. And they're kind of in a new era now where its sex is still like male, female, unknown, but it's also kind of becoming coupled with more information, such as things like organ inventories, which is basically where you can actually know, like, does this person have a cervix? Does this person have ovaries? Do they have testes? Which can kind of give you some insights as to what that person's physiology is, what surgeries they may have had, but it really varies. There's not really like a standardized protocol for that yet. But it does mean that we have some more relevant information. But especially since this has been so recent, a lot of machine learning studies, anything published even today might be using older data. And so it's really only very recently that we've gotten access to the kinds of data that we might think that we might need to be inclusive. Okay. And so I was kind of talking before about how it can be really difficult to know when you have someone's sex, what to do with it. So This diagram here is basically showing that you can have a legal sex, which is maybe what's on your driver's license. You can have a sex that you were assigned at birth, which is often on your birth certificate, although sometimes you can change your birth certificate. And then you have someone's gender identity. So when these things perfectly line up, you can say, okay, well, I can use legal sex or sex assigned at birth or gender identity because they're all the same. But you can see that there's many different categories here where it's kind of like a question mark. So this means that we can't just like look at sex and know exactly what to do, but that makes things really difficult for people receiving care because a lot of times people have to input a sex. And so kind of it's up to the doctor to kind of just guess, especially if they don't know what the correct one should be. And so one of the ways that clinicians are kind of trying to address this now is like basically putting information that is much more relevant actually like to help interpret results. So for example, this is me from when I had a pap smear. They list out all these different things and that kind of gives some more information about what you might need to know in terms of specifics. So when we analyzed studies that used electronic health records data, we saw a lot of different misconceptions, and these misconceptions are echoed in broader misconceptions about sex and gender in society. So the first one is that gender is rooted in physiology. So it's the idea that if you know someone's sex, you also know their gender. And the most common thing that happens with this is that sex gets called gender all the time. I think this is meant to be a sort of progressive thing that rather than using the word sex, you're using the word gender. But then people often say gender and then they say male, female. And so that's a little bit confusing because you're like, okay, well, did you really actually mean sex or did you really mean gender, but you just used male, female? Most of the time, that means that it was a sex field, but they called it male and female. And we actually had a doctor who we cited in one of our articles talking about this issue, who said, yes, actually, it was actually sex, but we called it gender. And now we know we need to fix it. But also, like, they didn't necessarily know what to do, if they should go back and update their paper or how they should address it. The other really common misconception that we see in these machine learning papers is this idea that like gender is in the mind and sex is in the body. So like these are like basically completely decoupled now instead. And so this is from an article about the VA's implementation of the gender identity field in an EHR, where they talk about how birth sex is an important structured variable, and that gender identity fields are also independently helpful, but the goal of those is to ensure proper pronoun use and avoid misgendering a patient. So there are a lot of clinicians who still believe that a person's sex assigned at birth is like the most important variable about their health, even though they could be on hormones or have had surgeries which are severely altering their physiology. There's still kind of this assumption that like the sex is the thing that matters the most. And that gender is really just about like patient care, like not misgendering people. And this kind of attitude, I think, has made it so that there haven't been as many advancements about care for transgender people, generally speaking. And then the last one is this idea that gender may influence physiology. So one of the things I want to emphasize here is that a lot of times when we think about talking about gender issues, people think, oh, this is just like a trans people thing and it doesn't really affect cis people. But gender influences sex for all people. It's not just a trans thing. And so sort of like Sarah was talking about, like, if we do better science, then that science will benefit everyone, not just trans people. So I'm gonna skip this slide. Okay. So what can researchers and developers do that would make machine learning as inclusive as possible? So I think there's a lot of different challenges that need to be addressed. One of them, the first one is mindset. The second one is incentives, and the third one is infrastructure. So I'll start with mindset. So there are a lot of attitudes about this that I think kind of prevent people from even wanting to take any steps to address these issues. And so I found that there's like kind of different stages that people are in as they kind of accept that maybe this is the thing we should do something about. I think the first one is this idea of like sex as a binary demographic variable. So there's basically just people who are at this stage where they just don't even acknowledge that this is an issue at all. There's just no mention. Um, then you have people who we call the gender caveat. They acknowledge that there's some sort of issue, but they don't do anything about it. So they say, we know that gender or sex or gender are not binary and they're not the same thing, but we're just going to do our paper as if they were. So they don't actually do anything different. Um, and then the last one is, well, if we made any good progress, any progress at all, that's good progress. So, for example, this comes up a lot when people talk about how they're trying to do, like, for example, women's health research, but they're doing it in a way that excludes trans people. So they're saying, oh, but it's better for women, so like trans people should basically just wait in line. So we can kind of see that we need to challenge like all of these different mindsets if people are actually going to create technologies and models that work for trans people. So in terms of the incentives and infrastructure challenges, there's kind of like a publish or perish or just ship it kind of attitude. So people aren't always incentivized to slow down, figure out what data they really need, answer the questions that they need. Like Sarah talked about, like these analysis questions. People don't always take the time to really think about designing the proper study, getting the right data, et cetera. In addition, like scale is intention and inclusivity. So especially in machine learning, big data kinds of things, they want to work with these huge data sets. And the larger the data set, the less information they're going to have on any individual. The other thing is that these data and schema are entrenched. So if you want to use any historical data, they just don't have it. It's hard to get people to update things. And the other kind of important side thing is that electronic health records are not actually designed for research purposes. So a lot of machine learning is kind of using this like as exhaust, and not focusing on like proactively using databases. So I think one of the reasons that I think mindset is really important to focus on is because it's actually one of the most powerful levers that we have. So Tanella Meadows is this amazing systems thinking author. And in one of her articles called Leverage Points, she talks about mindset. And mindset is like the second most powerful thing you can do to change a system, besides the power to transcend paradigms, which is very hard to change. That's why I actually think that like when we kind of change our attitudes, we will then be creative and find ways to actually change things. So in terms of like a mindset shift, I think right now the way things work with like the just ship it kind of incremental attitude is sort of like a greedy algorithm. So we basically look for the best thing that we can do at the next step. We do that thing and then we move on. We get the paper, we get tenure, whatever it is. But to do better, we actually kind of have to step back. We have to figure out like what's the optimal path kind of forward in aggregate. And one of the ways we can think about that is this idea of designing from the margins, where you think about the people who are historically discentered, in this case, like this blue chunk here, and you design something that works for them, and then everyone else will benefit rather than kind of like starting with this black slice and then maybe going a little bit out, or maybe not. In terms of incentive and infrastructure, it's always going to be the carrot and the stick. But I think the big thing is to support people already doing the work and training new people, which I'll kind of talk about in a couple minutes. And then also like support the development of more inclusive methods, data sets, EHR, et cetera. So one of the big challenges is like, well, the data set's not out there. I don't know what to do, or I don't know how to run the statistics. I'm actually really interested for statisticians to come up with cool ways to analyze things in non-binary ways. Not my area, but I think it would be really interesting. And then also a big thing is like stop funding publishing research that really lists limitations but doesn't do anything to try to improve on it. I think it's gotten to the point where people just do the dreaded gender caveat and then they don't really change anything from there. And I think we've gotten to a point where there should be enough knowledge in the field that that's not acceptable, and then people should change. But I think conferences or publication venues or granting agencies haven't really like kind of like laid down the line and said this is what you have to do. Another thing is like accountability and auditing for already deployed models. This is actually a very active like part of machine learning research already, which is good. So I want to pivot a tiny bit, just talk about like, how can you support people that are kind of already doing the work? And as a reminder, this is like a collaboration between me and like over 20 other trans scientists and parents of trans people. And this one I kind of tried to summarize a bunch of our recommendations that we have in the back of the paper. If you read the intro and other parts, we kind of put like this trans issue in part of broader society. but I'll just focus on the recommendations right now. So one of my personal pet peeves has been around using people's preferred names and pronouns. So I think when you think about like supporting trans people, you're like, oh, obviously pronouns, like I will always use people's pronouns. It's great. But one of the things that I've noticed, especially in like faculty only spaces or like spaces with people who are older, is that they're less willing to volunteer their pronouns, particularly in person. This can create a space where like if I'm the only person that uses pronouns that people might not guess just from looking at me, it puts me in a very like awkward position because like 20 people introduce themselves and no one used their pronouns, and it's like weird when your students are way better at it. So if you're faculty, I think it's like good to normalize doing that around other faculty. The other thing is like learning about what's happening with anti-LGBTQ legislation in your state or your county or whatever, and advocating around that. If you're an educator, you can highlight the work of queer and trans scientists. And another big thing is to challenge anti-trans stereotypes or attitudes in your workspace. So, if you want to start doing some sort of analysis and people are like, oh, people can't change their sex or sex is binary, there's like way you can kind of like educate yourself and push back on that. In terms of institutional actions, there's like a lot of things that we came up with. So if you have some sort of power in your institution, you could look at some of these. So we think that institutions have to create environments that are like physically and socially safe for trans people. So bathrooms is kind of like one of the big obvious ones, but one of the other ones that people talked about in the paper is the idea of gender inclusive spaces where people can feel kind of safe to unwind, kind of like a third place situation. And the other big thing that we spent a lot of time talking about is about not platforming anti-trans pseudoscience that's masquerading as scholarship. I think it can be really thorny to try to balance like needs for free speech with the needs for a safe environment on campus, as we have seen with like a lot of discussion around Israel-Palestine, like this past academic year. But I think it's really important for academic institutions to think about that and figure out ways to do that. Because right now there's a lot of platforming of like anti-trans sentiments just as this idea of like, oh, we're just asking questions, or like, the science isn't settled and it's mostly in bad faith. The other thing is inclusive policies, so like bathroom anti-harassment policies, many of which already exist, but could be better. In terms of trans inclusive healthcare, I think that there's been a lot of strides in this, but one of the things that's often missing is like paid time off for surgeries. In terms of conferences, we talked a lot about like not hosting events in places that are hostile to trans people. So just as a personal example, like the conference for one of the medical organizations that I'm a part of is hosting their event in Florida. And so I'm just not going. And also, if someone can't attend for a variety of reasons, maybe you can support remote attendance or provide funding for people to attend events. Another one, I think particularly around like tenure and promotion and like supporting people's advancement is like recognizing like the need for like tenure transition-based delays, like the way you might for like a parental leave. And also like recognizing DEIJ contributions as part of a scholar's contribution. So this is true, for a variety of activism, but many LGBT people participate in these things. And kind of the point that I want to emphasize that a lot of us focused a lot in our paper was just how trans scientists, like our freedom and our oppression, are all linked with lots of other important activist movements. So like any success for trans folks has to be in solidarity with similar movements. And so like I talked about with like designing for the margins for machine learning, I think we really want to think about designing for the margins also when we talk about like supporting trans science. Okay. So yeah, I think we can support trans scientists by doing better research to support our health and well-being and designing environments and events. And we can also think critically about sex and gender, and remember that it's not just a trans issue, it's a really important science issue, it's an equity issue for everyone. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie. That was a fantastic talk, and I think that it really dovetailed very well with Sarah's talk. And I think that it was really interesting to just think about again, how our biases can then lead into kind of fallacies and issues in the models that we are building, and just for people to be thinking about the consequences of that. So again, thank you so much for your talk. And just to reiterate, if you happen to have any questions, we want questions, please drop them in the Q&A. And after our third talk, we're gonna have a Q&A discussion session. So just keep that in mind. So for our third and final talk, we have Suzanne Thornton. She is a statistician at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. She graduated with a PhD in statistics from Rutgers in the fall of 2019. Her professional interest in trans and gender nonconforming representation began while working as a statistical consultant on a project to model drug-resistant epilepsy. Together with several statistical co-authors, she published the article Towards Statistical Best Practices for Gender and Sex Data in the Significance magazine, and she will be presenting at a session titled Missingness, Marginalization, and Misinformation, Data Issues and Research for Marginalized Groups at the Joint Statistical Meetings, JSM, this August. Her talk is titled Statistical Representation of Gender and Sex Diversity. So again, thank you, Suzanne, for speaking, and I'll hand over the mic to you now.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Just to double check, can we all see my slides and not my notes?
We're good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Those were two really interesting and informative talks, and I hope that this is a comparable or worthy follow talk. As a statistician, I'm going to be sharing with you my observations throughout my career and my training as a theoretical statistician, and a bit of my experience as an applied statistician as well. I have decided to orient my talk in a way that I want to show you what my claim is up front at the very beginning, and have also want to present you up front at the beginning with some common counter arguments that I have heard from statistical practitioners. I'll be addressing these counter arguments throughout the talk. So my claim or claims that I want to make throughout this presentation is that science points to the need for an even more careful consideration of sex and gender in human studies, at least, and also possibly, as Sarah is saying, even more and more than just human studies, than simply asking, are women included in the data? So, also that fundamental statistical knowledge can help us understand why there is this need. So if we look at the counter arguments that I have put on this page here, we'll be revisiting them throughout my talk. The first point, they're ordered sort of in a way, according to my opinion, in the strength of the counter arguments, the weakest ones at the top and the stronger ones at the bottom. And these are, again, counter arguments that I've heard and you may have encountered, or you may even think that are countering the claim that we need to statistically represent the variability in human sex and gender. So the first of these and the weakest of these counter arguments is I've heard people say binary sex or binary gender is a common practice. It's how it's always been done in this field, in this discipline. It's how we're going to continue to do that. I'm not going to spend much time on this counter argument besides mentioning it, because this is a logical fallacy. This is a bit of a red herring argument that appeals to tradition. This kind of reasoning, this is how it's always been done, so we're going to continue to do it, is invalid logic, and it produces bad science. I'm going to go ahead and focus on the remaining 5 counter arguments of this talk. I'm not going to address, if you look at the counter argument number 4, I'm not going to address the first part. So this counter argument is that sex is binary, and for the vast majority of people, sex and gender coincide. So I will address the second part of this counter argument in the first part of my talk. But the sex is binary part, we already had this wonderful presentation from Sarah and another wonderful presentation from Maggie, and plenty of resources in their presentations, and also some resources and references at the end of my presentation that I think can better argue against this kind of false statement than I can. So let's talk a little bit about some kind of Stats 101, fundamental statistical knowledge. In statistics, it's important for us to keep in mind that you get what you measure. This quote is taken from the scientist Richard Hamming in his book on doing better science and engineering. This was actually the title of a chapter, and I have some more quotes from this chapter in the rest of my talk. It's a really eye-opening, I think, book chapter. So if we are measuring something, that's what we are going to, that's the only thing we can see or conclude or observe in our analysis. The kind of things that we measure, we call variables in statistics, and we have 2 different types of variables. We have inherently what are measurable, mathematically measurable features, and these are numeric variables, things like weight, for instance, and height. We also have categorical variables. This is a different type of variable that is meant to encapsulate something that's qualitative or descriptive. And we have different types of categorical variables. The 2 most common are ordinal and nominal. And in just about every introductory stats book and class, you will see examples given of a nominal categorical variable being sex, and usually it's binary sex, or it's conflated with binary gender. Another common example of nominal categorical variables are race and ethnicity. So there are actually a couple more types of categorical variables, and the important thing I want to emphasize is that the way we measure a categorical variable, that is the way that we determine different levels or categories within a single categorical variable meant to encapsulate a single descriptive feature of our data subjects. The way that we measure a categorical variable, it determines its statistical classification. That means it determines the way that this information can and will be used in your statistical analyses. So if we just think, for example, about we want to study people, a population or a sample that's representative of some population, and we want to study a descriptive variable related to education. Here are 4 different examples of different ways of measuring education. We could ask, is an individual receiving any formal education? Yes or no. That is a binary categorical variable because there are only 2 possible outcomes or categories. We could ask instead, what type of education is an individual receiving? Public, private, homeschool? These are nominal levels of a categorical variable. We could instead ask, what is the highest level of education an individual has received? For example, what is the highest degree they've attained? This is an example of a categorical variable, but there is a sense of order here. There's a higher and lower degrees, although distance kind of between these levels is not necessarily clearly defined. This is an example of an ordinal categorical variable. And then another type of categorical variable, it's sort of maybe seems a bit numeric in some sense, but this is called the interval or ratio type of categorical variable. And this could be, for example, if we ask people, how many years of education have you completed? The answers may vary, and the answers will be numbers, but there are likely to be discrete clusters of certain numbers. So we may treat that as a categorical variable in our statistical analysis. The type is just an interval or a ratio type of categorical variable. This slide gives kind of more careful definitions of these 4 types of categorical variables. A categorical variable has a measurement scale that consists of different levels or different categories. Who chooses those levels? Who chooses those categories? It's not necessarily going to be the statistician, although it is something that a statistician should be able to consult a practitioner on. But it is a subjective choice for the researcher who is collecting the data or analyzing it, or the PI in charge of the study. Another thing about, I'll let you read, I'm not going to read off these definitions to you for these different types of categorical variables, but another thing I want to note is that an important property of categorical variables is that the levels or categories, that is our scale of measurement, they have to be mutually exclusive and ideally exhaustive. So with that in mind, I want to take a second and think about what if we're looking at variables related to sex or gender? Here are some example questions of each of these 4 different types of categorical variables that are all related to the concept of human sex or gender. So keeping in mind, the way that we define or measure a categorical variable is going to determine how it is used statistically. So we could ask, does an individual have a prostate? That is a yes or no question, a binary categorical variable. We could ask, which gonads are functional in an individual? Testes, ovaries, neither. That's an example of a nominal categorical variable. We could ask, say, how feminine is an individual's personality? Very feminine, moderately feminine, or not at all. That's an example of an ordinal categorical variable. And then we could look at something like, what is the prevalence of androgens in a certain individual, or in our data subjects. And this could be an example of an interval or ratio categorical variable. The main point here is that the measurement of sex and gender is kind of ill-defined. It's open, it's subjective, and it's open to interpretation, and it depends largely on the context of a particular study. So when we think about one of the counter arguments that I presented before, mainly the one about, for the vast majority of people, gender and sex coincide. So this, representing gender and sex diversity maybe isn't something we should be concerned with. Well, I think, in response to that, we have to think historically, how have we been measuring sex and gender? Historically, the binary model has dominated our science disciplines and our medical applications and our policy applications. There are current estimates for, say, the prevalence of intersex traits within the populations. But I think these things are very difficult to estimate because we have not been asking the right questions or using the right kind of measurement scales in our categorical variables to be able to concretely, I think, answer these kinds of questions. And it's also important to consider whether or not outliers or individuals maybe in the margins or in minor groups matter for your question or your research question. The answer is going to be context specific, but it's an important one that we ask. So you might wonder what kind of guidance can statistics provide in how we define a categorical variable, that is, the measurement scale that we choose for our categorical variable. Unfortunately, throughout my years of education and experience in statistics, I have found very little guidance on this topic. And I think that's unfortunate because this topic is related to very active areas of research and very kind of quickly adapting into our everyday life kind of areas of applied machine learning and AI. There's plenty of computer science research on clustering, automated data classification, and the like. But I have not seen as much statistical caution or consideration for the actual measurement scales of the categorical data that is being used in these applications. So I want to emphasize this quote here again from Richard Hamming in that same book chapter titled "You Get What You Measure." The way we choose to measure things controls to a large extent what happens in our analyses, what conclusions we get from our analyses. And it's important to remember that the popularity of a form of measurement has little relationship to its accuracy or its relevance. So what are some things that we can consider and ask ourselves when we are trying to choose an accurate and relevant measurement scale for a categorical variable related to, say, gender or sex? I think there are these kind of 4 key things for us to consider, and here are the related questions. First, consider the relevance. What features of this categorical or descriptive variable, sex or gender or both, do you think are relevant in your study? That's an important question to ask before you choose the levels. Also, for coherency's sake, it's important to ask, what are the similar characteristics within each level that you want to distinguish? And for the validity of our variables, we want to ask, are the levels mutually exclusive? And also for the representation of our variable to the population of interest, we want to also make sure we consider who might be missed. Who might these levels miss or misclassify? And this kind of careful statistical consideration at the onset of a study, I think it addresses the counter arguments about, incorporating sex and or gender variability will erase the representation of, say, cisgender women, or that data subjects will be confused or offended. If you properly consider the variable you are defining and the measurement scale you are asserting, these counter arguments should really be non-issues from a statistical perspective. Finally, as far as the kind of fundamental statistical lessons or knowledge regarding categorical data analysis and collection, I want to mention a well-known phenomena in statistics called Simpson's paradox. This is a phenomena where we see a particular trend or signal, statistical signal, when we look at the data one way, but when we include, say, another dimension, or another categorical variable, or another feature, the trend that we saw initially is swapped. It's reversed. These tables here are based on real data. I forget, I think it was from the 70s, and I forget where in the US the data was collected, but my source is cited at the end. But this was looking at the prevalence of death sentences for offenders based on their race, whether they were Black or white. And you can see on the left-hand side, if we just look at overall the rate of death sentences per 1,000 offenders, it appears to be lower for Black offenders than white offenders. But if we also consider the additional dimension of not just the offender's race, whether the offender was Black or white, but also whether or not the victim was Black or white, we see that trend swap. And we see that actually Black offenders in either case, whether the victim was Black or the victim was white, Black offenders receive the death sentence more frequently than white offenders. A related phenomena is, and this is something that actually Simpson described in the paper that, kind of led to this paradox having the name of Simpson's paradox. He also described a phenomena or a paradox of whether or not there's a sensible interpretation of data, whether or not it exists. And how do we know? How do we know? Should we look at data that is disaggregated into different dimensions, considering more variables? Or should we look at the data that is clustered together? Is there a way to know whether or not there's a sensible interpretation? And I mean, the answer to that is that the correct interpretation of data, it can't be reliably determined just by looking at a summary of the numbers, say, in these tables, for example. We actually need to know our data, how the data was collected, what might not have been collected, and how the categorical variables were measured and why. And more importantly, we also need to know what we want out of our data. On this next slide, this is not real data. This is made up data, just meant to illustrate how this is a related phenomena, not Simpson's paradox necessarily per se, but it's a related phenomena where if we are looking at data related to, say, employees at a large company, and let's say we're looking for evidence of gender discrimination. On the left-hand side, this measurement, the only thing that's different, it's the same people represented in each table, but the thing that's different from the left-hand side table and the right-hand side table is the measurement scale. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at gender, and we're looking at gender as a binary variable. So gender identity for individuals was recorded as, are you a woman or not? If we look at the chi-squared analysis of this table, we'll find a really large p-value, and we'll conclude there's no statistical evidence to support the claim that there is, gender discrimination in the promotion process at this company. However, if you look at the table on the right, again, the totals are the same. That's the same individuals at the company in this hypothetical company. But if we now look at gender identity as a nominal categorical variable and not a binary one, and we consider the different levels as, say, first, is somebody trans or gender non-conforming? Second level, is somebody a cisgender woman? Third level, is somebody a cisgender man? If we perform the same chi-squared procedure, but on this table, we have a really small p-value, and the conclusion is we have statistical evidence that indicates there may be gender discrimination in the promotion process at this company. So when we think about these kind of first four arguments here, I think they're relatively weak arguments, but they're arguments you will hear nonetheless. I think they can all be addressed by a more thoughtful and careful kind of statistical education. These are fundamentals that every statistician is in theory, trained to know and to understand. but they are not necessarily emphasized in a way that makes obvious the connection to the way we think about things like gender and sex. Finally, I'm going to wrap up with in the last couple of minutes here by addressing the last two counter arguments. First, people may say, I just don't know how. How do I incorporate sex and or gender variability in my research? I have a few thoughts, and they're shared with you on this slide. But I also wanted to mention that the resources page at the end of my presentation, I give many different resources that show you some of the examples of pretty current work that address this question specifically. So my first point is, it's important to consider which features of gender or sex are relevant to your problem. When you think about what is it about gender, what is it about sex that I think is related to my research question or my my problem, it helps us move towards descriptive categorizations and away from connotative ones. And it's also useful to include when you are sharing your data or sharing your analysis of some data, to make sure you include descriptions of how this information was obtained. Was it obtained by the subject's direct response, by a doctor's observation, or some other way? That is valid and important statistical information to determine how to proceed with the analysis. And then also, it's really important to actually assess whether or not it is crucial for you to identify gender or sex minorities. If it is crucial for your research question to identify gender or sex minorities, then you need to make sure that you plan for small sample sizes in advance. Biggest recommendation I can give for that is to consult a statistician before you collect data. Statisticians can give you sample size estimates. If you explain to a statistician, what it is about sex or gender that you're trying to kind of encapsulate in your measurement scale, they can help you make plans to collect a sample of data that will allow you to actually answer your research question. And something you can do to help mitigate potential non-response bias from gender or sex minorities who may not feel safe or comfortable identifying as such is to also consider using randomized response surveys. These have been used to study things like abortion and other topics that might be sensitive where respondents might feel uncomfortable answering honestly. And then sort of my last recommendation here, and this is something that I think Maggie mentioned in their presentation, is kind of, and this is sort of my worst case scenario example, is to use a two-step question procedure. There are many different examples of two-step question procedures that could be used. Again, some are in these resources at the end of my presentation. Here, I give you a couple that I think might be sort of widely applicable. For the first example, the two questions are: one, which sex were you assigned at birth? And two, what is your current gender identity? By comparing the answers to these questions, we can identify individuals who are potentially gender or sex minorities. Second example, we could have the first question be, what is your gender identity? And the second question be, have you always identified with this gender? So these are just a couple of examples. There are many other ways to go about a multi-step question procedure. And then finally, the last counter argument, which I think is actually the strongest from a statistical perspective, is that if we allow for sex or gender variability, this makes it difficult to combine data from different and possibly historical sources. So I think this is a valid point. And from a statistical perspective, this could lead to challenges and make your data not compatible, say, in a meta-analysis. There's going to be a trade-off between the quality of your present or new data and the ability to sort of increase your sample size with historic data or data that's already been collected, or maybe even data that's collected, but from different cultures, or it's international data. The kind of the argument that I come back to here in response to this challenge is that data-driven decisions can only ever be as good as the data that is driving them. In other words, garbage in, garbage out. If we are not careful about the quality of the data when we obtain it, it doesn't matter how sophisticated our statistical or machine learning procedures are, they're going to fail us at some point, because they are going to be based on garbage data. And I'm kind of reminded of this popular cartoon. I apologize, I don't have a source for the cartoon. I think it went viral on LinkedIn a while ago. But there's often at least an initial kind of cost and time and resources and other things towards adapting a change, even if that change is going to lead to better scientific progress in the long run. And then I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, but I also think that there are very strong ethical responses to the counter argument about allowing sex and gender variability makes it difficult to combine data from different sources. And I think that ethical statistical practitioners need to consider, for example, the guidelines given by the American Statistical Association as to how an ethical statistical practitioner behaves. So in conclusion, science points to the need for an even more careful consideration than simply asking, are women included in the data? Fundamental statistical knowledge can help us understand why this is important. And additionally, I think considering the intricacies of sex and gender as human concepts can lead to interesting questions for novel statistical approaches for things like categorical variables that could change. The observed value of this variable could change over time for an individual, or maybe categorical variable membership is fuzzy, not so concrete in one level or another. These are areas for potentially new methodological approaches in statistics. Here are the references for all of my tables and examples and quotes. And I'm going to take a moment and show you these slides to you in case you want to take a screenshot. These are some resources on why sex and gender are not binary. And the next slide is resources on how to capture sex and gender variation. My slides are available on my academia.edu page for free. So if you want to just search my name, Suzanne Thornton, and academia.edu, you can look at my different talks that I've given and uploaded there. And this is one of them in case you are interested in referring to these resources in the future. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for that talk. And it kind of reiterated, so I happen to be one of the co-authors on the paper that Suzanne was the main lead author on. And when we were developing or writing that paper and having these conversations, one of the major takeaways, which I feel like you reiterated in this presentation, was, do you even need to collect the gender and sex variable? Or is that serving as a proxy for something else? And that, to me, is something that I've carried forward in my practice, is just questioning, do you really need this? Or could you ask a better question? So I think that was really useful and to touch upon here.
Thanks so much, Stephen.
Okay, so now this is our Q&A session. And so if you happen to have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. I have some questions for each of you panelists, and I'm going to just let you kind of volunteer yourselves to answer these questions, and maybe some of them apply to you, some of them may not, or you may have a strong reaction. So feel free to share your thoughts. So the first question that I have for you is, what has been the reaction to your publications within your discipline or amongst your colleagues? Has there been a reaction, or have you had any conversations around it? Again, feel free to take the mic.
I'm happy to start. I'll say that when I start, and Steve and I kind of started on this looking at sex and gender and the way we represent these qualities statistically a while back. I've seen two different reactions. I've seen a reaction where there's a very kind of positive, either yes, I already knew that, or I had no idea. You have introduced a new perspective to me, and I'm interested in learning to do better. And so it's enabled me to sort of find peers and a network, a professional network of others who are thinking about similar things. And then I also had reactions from kind of the so-called gender critical kind of group of scientists, and I suspect also of statisticians, although they have not necessarily contacted me directly. I've our paper and significance. It was essentially kind of undone by a subsequent, in the very next year, another significance article by a gender critical social scientist who accused of us of advocating for eliminating sex entirely, and who misrepresented our ideas and our paper to sort of get to her point that sex is binary, and it's what we should be, recording and collecting always, essentially. And unfortunately, there were plenty of responses and issues with that article, and responses to that article that were not published by Significance. And instead, Significance chose to publish kind of additional favorable gender critical reviews and comments to this article.
I would say that the rigorous science one that we published with like the 20 people, that one came out pretty recently, like only a couple months ago. So far, my impression, like from seeing people posted on social media, was that mostly positive, a couple trolls, but overall pretty positive. Some of the stuff, the sex and gender research that I've been working on for the last couple of years, we've gotten a lot of interest from that. Like, for example, like I got invited to talk with the NIH about like the women's health part of the NIH. So that was really exciting. Before that, Kendra and I worked on this paper about the weight scale algorithms and weight scales, because they also use binary sex in them, and about like, well, if a non-binary person steps on the scale, like what do they do? What do they choose? And kind of exploring that in a paper, which was really fun. And I actually did get an email from someone who said, well, like your scale doesn't care about your gender, blah, 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 blah. There's no such thing as like non-binary gender when it comes to like physiology. And I got to just write back to him. And I was like, did you even read our paper? It's all about that. And I was very polite and explained it. And then he was like, oh, okay. Yeah, like, I guess that makes sense. Like, maybe we should think about that. And I was like, okay, I'm glad we had this chat. So I think I've been pleasantly surprised. There hasn't been a ton of backlash about the stuff that we've been doing.
Yeah, and the two projects that I presented, both of them were invited by those society journals and special editors. And so that already felt like quite a welcoming avenue to share those ideas. And I would say that they have been pretty well received. But there's also been some criticism, especially for the multivariate sex paper, from kind of an angry evolutionary biologist who's often angry about a lot of issues that have to do with like the changing demographic of who does science today. And it hurt because he actually like wrote the book on speciation that was like my Bible in grad school. And so it's like, how can you wrestle with what a species is so eloquently, but then not have that same kind of generosity of like understanding the variation in sex? But for the most part, I would say it's been really supportive, and the special issue in integrative and comparative biology, we've also, I think, been really supported by the editorial team there in both the special issue itself, right? The idea for a society to platform these ideas, but then also protecting us. So there were rebuttals that were submitted, and the society chose not to publish them because they didn't find them in good faith. And that's really interesting to handle, right? Like, that could be perceived as censorship, but it could also be perceived as, well, your arguments actually aren't really biological. They're coming from your own mindset that you're imposing on the data. And so, who sort of gets to control those narratives, I think often comes down to the community, and the leaders in that community are often the editorial staff in scientific societies and journals. And that, I think, has been really amazing, to be, early career researchers mostly doing this work, to be supported by that leadership.
Fantastic. I mean, thank you so much for your insights. And I'm wondering, like, on top of that, for the research that you've done that's kind of outside of this field, or like not as focused on gender and sex issues, um, how has this research, how is it valued differently between, let's say, the less controversial things that maybe you've done? Do you feel like it's being valued differently in your community? Do you sense a difference there?
I would say for me, I think they're like have almost been completely different. Like I went up for tenure in February, and I kind of wrote my dossier saying like I have all this biomedical research that I do, and then I have all the sex and gender research that I do, and they're kind of two different things. And I was really worried when I was like getting people to write letters about, how we would find, like, would we be able to find someone who could comment on the diversity of work that I do? And the answer was like, kind of not really. So we had some people who commented on one thing and people who commented on the other thing. And I was actually to be honest, I was incredibly anxious that someone who was doing the review for this like bioimpedance medical wearable research that I do, that they were going to say something really horrible and tank my tenure case. But I was like, it doesn't matter. I'm going to do this work anyway. And fortunately, that didn't really happen, as far as I'm aware. I did get tenure, but it's just like there was no. It didn't seem like there was like they were had to cover for any of that or anything. But I do think my experience has basically been like they kind of ignore it, or they think it's cool, or they don't really have a strong opinion. But like I said, like the people reviewing my tenure case are, the people who had agreed to have this big conference in Florida. So I just think it's just not really part of the conversation for them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that too. I mean, it gets personal, right? Like when your career's on the line and like how the field is viewing you. I recently switched institutions, and when I was interviewing for the job that I have now, I did include the sex variation and diversity at the end of my talk. It was a talk about like genomics and hormones and behavior in birds. But then I kind of broadened it out of like, why does it matter? And I had a meeting with the chair during that interview, and she was like, that was so brave of you. It was really bold. And I was like, oh, I didn't even like at that point in my work, that was the department seminar that I was used to giving, and it made sense to me. And I had to remember that, there's different cultures in different departments, and that really could be perceived as challenging some paradigms that could upset people. But I felt that, I mean, I got the job, so it was well received. And I think it could be also kind of a shift. I think there's so many more papers now, special issues now, and maybe just because I'm becoming more in this field, like I said, I started out as a speciation biologist, but because I study behavior and hormones and variation among sexes, like it's hard for me not to also think about like the science and technology studies aspect, the STS aspect of this work. And it's not something that I was formally trained in, but I just felt like I'm a scientist that exists in this world. And so like I have a responsibility to acknowledge these things and the way that, sex as a biological variable, like what biological sex is and how that's communicated outside of biology. And I think that it's a really amazing time actually to be a biologist and a scientist and doing this work. And I think that it matters to take that on and not just say like, well, everything I do is neutral and I'm going to stay in my lane, so to speak. But yeah, I agree that it can have professional consequences for better or worse.
Yeah, I think that the field of statistics and math and maybe more theoretical scientific disciplines have a lot of catching up to do to the applied sciences in this regard. I essentially as a grad student, I remember being told that if there were issues or special things that I, values related topics that were important to me, to essentially put them on hold and focus on my theoretical research first, and then come back to those in the future. Ultimately, I decided that I wasn't going to do that. I think that to me, there is a great urgency in talking about these things in every discipline and every aspect of my life, and a big part of my life is my professional life. When I went up for my tenure review, I was not granted tenure, and I'll be honest, I do think that the work and the effort that I put into discussions and events like this and discussions around LGBT plus inclusivity in data and statistical practices and methodology isn't valued as much because it's seen as a special topic, kind of passion project, and not given the kind of weight of actually being an interesting philosophical point. So yeah, I think these things can vary by field, and it's really encouraging to hear, Maggie and Sarah, what you've experienced so far. And I'd really be interested to hear how things go and continue to go for you in the future. I know that these are recent publications that you both have mentioned in your presentations.
So, continuing with this thread, what have you yourself learned? What have you learned about yourself while doing this research? Like, has there been some like realization? Maybe you like realized your own biases, or you realized, oh, I thought this one way, like subconsciously, and your research kind of like brought you to a different level of understanding. Like, has there been like shifts within inside of you as you've taken on your own research?
I can go first. Yeah, what you said about biases, I think recognizing your positionality in your work is really important, and I think everyone has a bias. So I think I've actually just brought what I would call my values to the forefront of my work. And so I think when I was earlier in my career as a grad student and a postdoc, I was maybe not as comfortable like sharing my values in my work or having those things like inform each other. But I think with more sort of feeling like I belong in my field, I think I had to prove my empirical chops to like some extent, but now feeling like I belong, I feel like I can become more of myself and have my values show up more in my work. And I think had it not been for like my exploration into sex variation and diversity, and really the invitation from people like Kelsey Lewis and Sam Sharp and Jess McLaughlin and Kinsey Brock, like these people that were leading symposia, or my co-authors, like encouraging me to like join their like creativity and pushing some of those boundaries and like making those sort of internal thoughts like more explicit in my work. And so I think, yeah, I owe also a lot of like that personal development to people who had been doing that work much longer than I had.
Personally, I think I have become more skeptical of studies when I hear about studies of, determining sex effects, or there's a big sex effect. I've become much more skeptical of this kind of research and these kind of publications. And I think I also personally, I realized that I think the best way for me to form lasting, meaningful professional relationships is by being, an advocate for LGBT people in my discipline as data subjects, for LGBTQ plus related research, that by sort of working towards values-based topics. That's how I found the most kind of meaningful and lasting professional relationships that serve me in many other ways as well.
I think for me, one of the big things we talk about in engineering is this idea of like what it means to be engineering design, and there's requirements, so things that a system needs to be able to do, and there are constraints. Those are things that are limiting you from doing those things. And I think one of the things that I've noticed is that the more you spend time in a field, the more you're familiar with the constraints. You're like familiar with like why things are hard to do, but sometimes those things really like you kind of like want to putting yourself in a box about like what the ways in which things can be different. And so I think like working with young people, or like having like a young mind, can kind of really encourage you to like acknowledge that those constraints are reality, but like also push yourself to move forward through them. And I think also, similarly, I think that people who don't want to change things point to constraints as reasons to not do things. And that's actually, Susie, one of the things I really liked about what your talk was, that you talked about like, well, these are all these like counter arguments and how a lot of them just aren't even any good. But like psychologically, you can be like, oh, I don't know, like that seems hard. I'm not sure I can do that. And it can be really hard to like get over that hurdle. But like thinking about like pushing yourself to get over those hurdles. And I think for me, when it comes to like sex and gender in research, this is something I'm super passionate about. Like it affects me personally. Like I'm really willing to like find a way through those hurdles. And then I've also tried to think about myself of like, when do I fall back on the, oh yeah, but like that would never work, or like have kind of like a fatalist attitude about other issues where I see people who are really passionate, and like, okay, like how do I challenge my own like attitude about that as well, to kind of act in solidarity, like the way that we talk about in the paper, about how it's really important to not just like advocate for people like us, but also for other people as well.
I'll add to this because I feel like I've gone over my own like evolution on this topic in my 30s, where I feel like, especially during like graduate school and early teaching, I basically did not integrate my sexuality. Like I was a teacher and then I was this other thing outside. And I feel like there's been this process, especially working on the paper with you, Suzanne, of like integrating the different sides of myself, because I feel like I've always kept them kind of separate. And I think that it's important for me to show up like a professor that I wanted as a student, essentially. Like I didn't have professors that were identifying as LGBTQ. And so I feel like it's important for me to show up for the students now and to be that person, to be that advocate. And I feel like that's something that gives me strength, because I do think that there's more students now identifying, and I think it's important to be an advocate and to use my position for advocacy. There was a question in the Q&A that I'm going to answer, and anyone else can answer. If there's certain books that were pertinent to you, like if you happen to, let me see if, so there was just a question. Well, no, the question was, I would like to see some training on how to handle when your child comes out as LGBTQ and how best to support them. And so when I read this question, I was thinking about certain books that were impactful for me as I was trying to um, as I was going through different parts of understanding my identity and so forth. So I'm gonna, I just pulled them off the shelf. So I'll just mention one book that I was really impactful in my 20s is called The Velvet Rage. And then another book that was really useful for me is this book called Out of the Shadows, Reimagining Gay Men's Lives. And both of these really put words to the experiences I had growing up gay in America in the 90s. And I don't know if anyone else has maybe resources or books or whatever that you think might be useful to share with the audience. I know it's not statistically related, but I think it might be useful.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Maggie. I don't necessarily have anything in particular to point you to. I mean, I think the internet is your friend. If you Google, how to support an LGBTQ plus child, you'll find a lot of resources and a lot of communities as well that can be helpful. But just the fact that, you're a parent that wants to support your child, that is the most consequential thing, I think. And that is going to go the longest way. That your child knows that you want to support them and that you care about them. That's huge.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I just to that person I just sent the link, but there's an organization called PFLAG, Parents and Families of Lesbians and Gay, I guess, youth. But so that's another resource that might be useful. That's focusing specifically on parents. And I agree with Suzanne, just that like um, I have a lot of friends that are raising kids right now, and a lot of them are coming to me and talking to me and like, how do I do the right thing? Like, what if my kid is trans? And it is just like, like follow your kids lead, love them unconditionally, reassure them that no matter what, you love them unconditionally. But also, like, I don't think you have to stress too much either. I think it's just be supportive of your kid and whatever they want. And unfortunately, the bar is really low. So just even doing those things, you're doing great.
Um, so another thing that like popped in my head as I was listening to everyone speak was, we hear so much about AI. And I think like each of the talks kind of touched upon this. But I was just kind of curious about like what fears do you have around AI? And given the way that gender and sex data have been collected historically, I can only imagine that if algorithms are developed on that historic data, it's only going to increase bias. Um, is there anything we can do? What could we do? I know that this is a really hard question, but this is something that like popped up in my thoughts several times as I was listening to you all. And I don't know if you have any thoughts or if you have any other worries around this idea.
So I could say about medicine is actually in a very interesting situation because doctors tend to actually be pretty resistant to the use of machine learning technologies, and certainly like completely like unsupervised kind of machine learning systems. So for example, like with bail setting, there are certain jurisdictions that just like have a computer do it and then don't even really audit it, and it's horrible. And that's not happening in medicine for the most part, which is really good. And I think the biggest reason for that is because doctors like need to control their reputation. There's also like medical malpractice lawsuits. There's a lot of risk. So that's actually encouraging. The thing that would kind of concern me is just this idea that especially as models become more complex, they're really hard to audit. They're basically black boxes. You can get in a situation, for example, there are machine learning models that help people administer anesthesia. What if there is a way where, you know, you're receiving the female dose when you're receiving the male dose and vice versa? And how much of that difference, is that a clinically significant difference? Like, could that be affecting outcomes for you in some impactful way? And just not necessarily like knowing why that is, and not being able to tease out the different role of these different variables. And the other thing is also just that, like, yeah, because you can't explain what a model is doing, it's becoming even harder to figure out what that sex or gender variable is standing in for, right? And if you're just so tempted to use this legacy data because you want to have lots of data for machine learning, then yeah, you're just going to be reinforcing these biases, as you said, Stephen. So I think there are definitely concerns, but I also think that it is somewhat encouraging that doctors are like somewhat careful about the use of machine learning, although I don't necessarily think like, oh, we're careful about it because of trans people. It's more like we're careful about it because it like affects the whole profession.
One thing I'll add to that is I think that there's the thing that kind of makes me nervous is sort of the separate domains in which AI and machine learning are used. There's the private domain, you know, for private enterprise, for companies. We've got so much of our information, our preferences, our habits are available to the highest bidder, who can access our Google accounts or our Meta accounts or so forth. And I think that the individuals or the institutions that have access to that data have some of the best quality information on gender and sex, and the best quality data, but that it's not necessarily subject to public scrutiny or in sort of the public knowledge as to how this information is being used. That concerns me. And I think that the level and the resolution of data that we have in the public sector is much poorer, and we don't have the kind of detailed information that you know wouldn't necessarily enable us to say, oh, this is an individual who maybe has who you know maybe is questioning their gender, or you know maybe could use support on some aspect of transitioning or something like that. I think that there's a difference in the public and private sector here, that is concerning.
To add like a non-human kind of perspective, I'm actually really excited by machine learning in biology because I think often we're very limited in like just binning things into two categories and seeing if there's a difference to like understand what a mechanism could be to explain variation in a behavior or morphology. And I actually like the idea of what if there's another pattern that we're not seeing that could be revealed, that could help us move away from, you know, this categorical view of males do this and females do this. So I have one PhD student who's working on machine learning to study bird migration. It has nothing to do with sex variation and diversity, but I know of papers of folks that are starting to do this work, at least to uncover, for instance, variation in bird song and between two species, like what are the traits that differ in their songs that the researchers might not have actually been thinking of measuring. So you can, you know, compare variation and see like what actually differs. But then the next step is to ask what's meaningful to those animals themselves. Because it's just, you know, it could be an artifact, or it, you know, just finding a difference isn't enough. But I do think there's utility in the approach of discovering new patterns that we didn't necessarily already anticipate ahead of time.
So it looks like we are just, you know, we're almost to the 2 hour mark here. And before I wrap up this webinar, I was wondering if any of the panelists have any like final words or final remarks that they want to say before I close this up.
You get what you measure.
I was just going to say that I thought it was really exciting to be on the panel with all three people, and I actually was also really excited about how like I kind of like was able to use some of what Sarah did, and then I think Suzanne, your part where you were able to then kind of follow. I said, oh, in my talk, it'd be really great if the statisticians started thinking about better ways to do this thing, and then you started talking about it. So that was really exciting for me, and I think I think the big takeaways is just that like we're kind of all in this together, and everyone has their own disciplinary angles to bring to it. But I think it's just important to have more events like this and be in conversation with people who are doing work in different areas.
Yeah, making the time in the space for these conversations, I think, is so important, and I'm really grateful to the ASA and to you all for holding this event.
Well, thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you to the panelists for taking the time this evening to deliver your talks. I really appreciate them. And again, this webinar will be available on, I believe, our YouTube, the ASA YouTube page in the future. But one thing that I was thinking about, as I was listening to all of your talks, it's just like, how important are, the fact that our perceptions shape our reality, right? So if we perceive sex to be binary, then that's going to influence our reality. And we need to be more conscious of how our assumptions of how things are, how that affects things downstream. And I think that all of your talks hit on that at different angles. And I think that that's so important in science to always review our assumptions, our models, and not just have to carry forward things that, we've done because we've always just done it that way. And I think that each of the talks kind of hit on that point of we don't need to just keep doing the same thing because we've always done it. We should update. So with that in mind, I also want to thank Donna. Donna is such a champion here for helping us organize this webinar and doing all the background work of putting this together, helping us advertise and so forth. So again, a big thanks for Donna. I really appreciate your work. And again, thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening or day, depending on where you are. And take care. Suzanne, do you have it? I'm taking that. No one else has any other thoughts to share? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all.